Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the rules of global trade no longer apply. Oil tankers have vanished. Sea lanes have turned into battlegrounds. And the world's most powerful superpower is doing nothing, except issuing carefully worded statements. This is not a movie. This is not a drill dot. This is one of the most dangerous geopolitical moments of the 21st century. Russia has crossed a line that hadn't been breached since the darkest days of the Cold War in a single coordinated operation. Russia forcibly seized American-linked oil and liquefied natural gas tankers across multiple oceans, from the volatile Black Sea to the frozen approaches of the Baltic and deep into the icy expanse of the Arctic. This was not a routine inspection. This was not an accident. It was a military operation. 12 massive energy vessels, over $3 billion in ship value, nearly $800 million worth of cargo, more than 40 Russian surface ships, air support overhead, and submarines reportedly positioned below. The message was unmistakable. No one interferes. Within hours, global panic set in. The White House went into emergency mode. NATO convened crisis meetings. Energy markets erupted into chaos. Oil prices spiked vertically. Shipping insurance premiums exploded. Several key maritime routes became effectively uninsurable overnight. This wasn't just a dispute between Russia and the United States. It was a systemic shock to the global economy, the illusion of impulsiveness to the casual observer. This looked like a reckless outburst from Moscow, a sudden emotional act of retaliation. That interpretation is dangerously wrong. What we are witnessing is not impulse. It is the culmination of years of planning. Russia is no longer absorbing sanctions. It is fighting back, and not with words, with leverage. How we got here? The story begins in 2022 and everything that followed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Western response went far beyond traditional trade restrictions. Russian banks were cut off from SWIFT. Hundreds of billions of dollars in central bank reserves were frozen. Thousands of individuals and companies were sanctioned, but the decisive blow came at the end of 2022. The oil price cap. The West believed it had engineered a precision weapon, one that would drain Russia's revenue without disrupting global energy flows. From Washington's perspective, it was an elegant policy. From Moscow's perspective, it was economic warfare. Oil and gas are the backbone of the Russian state. Black pawn. Russia's long game. Russia did not respond immediately. Instead, it adapted. Exports were redirected to Asia. Pipelines into China were expanded. Arctic shipping routes were developed. Financial systems outside Western control were built. These were not temporary fixes. They were preparations for a world in which Western rules no longer apply. The red line. By late 2024, the United States and its allies escalated further. Naval forces began boarding and inspecting tankers suspected of carrying Russian oil above the price cap, even in international waters. To Washington, this was sanctions enforcement. To Moscow, it was maritime coercion. Russia protested. It was ignored. Then everything changed. The spark in mid-December. An American-operated tanker collided with a Russian research vessel in northern waters. Several Russian sailors were killed. The United States called it an accident. Russia rejected that explanation entirely. Moscow claimed the tanker was a dual-use intelligence platform equipped with advanced surveillance systems. True or not, that narrative became the foundation of Russia's legal and strategic justification. The legal strategy in Russia framed the incident not as a military confrontation, but as a criminal investigation. Gross negligence, national security threats, unauthorized surveillance, environmental violations. The crews were labeled material witnesses, not hostages. That distinction mattered. It allowed Russia to act without triggering an automatic military response from NATO. January. The operation. In early January, Russian naval and Coast Guard forces launched simultaneous actions across multiple maritime theaters in the Black Sea. Tankers were escorted into Russian ports. In the Arctic, vessels were boarded under environmental pretexts. In the Baltic Sea, key choke points were tightly controlled. The operation was synchronized, deliberate, and overwhelming. This was not improvisation. It was execution. Strategic objectives. This move served three critical purposes. First, inflicting pain without war. Russia imposed real financial damage without firing a single missile. Second, exposing Western vulnerabilities. Shipping, insurance, and financing, the backbone of Western energy dominance, proved fragile. Third, domestic power projection. At home, the Kremlin projected strength, defiance, and resolve. The silence of the world. Perhaps the most revealing reaction was no reaction at all. Major non-Western powers remained silent. Energy-dependent countries faced an impossible choice: condemn Russia and risk supply disruptions, or remain quiet and preserve access. Most chose silence. And in geopolitics, silence is rarely neutral. The dangerous precedent: if Russia's logic is accepted, even partially, the implications are staggering. The South China Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea. Commercial shipping everywhere becomes vulnerable to state power. Freedom of navigation stops. being a rule and becomes a privilege. Reality check: this is not chaos for its own sake. It is a calculated challenge to a Western-dominated maritime order. Russia is signaling something fundamental. Rules enforced by power can be resisted by power. Economic warfare has become physical. Ships are no longer just carriers of goods. They are instruments of pressure. Final thoughts: a line has been crossed for decades. Global trade functioned on the assumption that commercial shipping was untouchable. That assumption is now dead. What replaces it will define the next era of global competition, an era where trade routes are front lines, and economic and military power are inseparable. The seizure of these vessels is not the end of a story. It is the opening chapter of a far more dangerous one. What Russia has done is not just retaliation. It is a test of how far economic warfare can go before it turns into something far more dangerous. And the results of that test are already rippling across the world. The immediate fallout: the moment the seizures were confirmed, the invisible machinery of global trade began to malfunction. Shipping insurers reacted first. Premiums for vessels operating near Russian-controlled or Russian-adjacent waters didn't just rise, they exploded. Some routes became uninsurable within hours. And when shipping becomes uninsurable, it doesn't matter what politicians say. Trade stops, tankers were rerouted, ports delayed arrivals, cargo sat idle, bleeding money by the hour. This is how pressure works in the modern world: quietly, brutally, and at scale. Energy markets. Fear moves faster than oil. Even before a single barrel failed to arrive, prices surged. Why? Because markets don't price reality, they price risk. And Russia had just injected massive uncertainty into the system. What if more ships are seized? What if crews are detained for months? What if entire routes become No one had answers, so traders did the only thing they could. They panicked. The result was volatility that spread far beyond energy into food prices, transport costs, and inflation expectations worldwide. Europe's quiet nightmare region felt this more acutely than Europe. Despite years of diversification, European supply chains remain entangled with routes passing near Russian-controlled waters. Many of the seized cargoes were not Russian-owned. They had been purchased through intermediaries, legally, under existing frameworks. Now, those frameworks mean nothing. Insurance may not cover the losses. Contracts are being disputed. Companies are absorbing multi-million-dollar hits overnight. And, slowly, a sobering realization is setting in. Doing business near Russia now carries geopolitical risk. No spreadsheet can fully price it. The human costs lost in the strategic analysis are the people trapped inside it. Hundreds of civilian crew members now find themselves in legal limbo. Regardless of the language used, material witnesses, investigations, inspections, their freedom depends on negotiations between rival governments. History offers little comfort. Such standoffs can last months, sometimes years. For those crews, geopolitics is no longer abstract. It is personal. The militarization of commerce. One of the most dangerous consequences of this episode is what comes next. If commercial shipping is now considered fair game, navies cannot remain on the sidelines. Expect armed escorts, increased patrols, and more aggressive posturing in contested waters. Every escort raises the risk of miscalculation. Every close encounter multiplies the chance of an accident. And accidents at sea between armed powers have a way of spiraling out of control. A fragmenting world. What is emerging is not a temporary disruption. It is a structural shift. Global shipping is beginning to fragment. Along geopolitical lines. Western fleets avoid adversarial waters. Russian and Chinese shipping dominates certain corridors. Parallel systems are replacing one integrated network. Efficiency gives way to redundancy. Cost savings give way to security concerns. Global trade becomes slower, more expensive, and less predictable. The legal battle underneath, perhaps the most overlooked front in this conflict, is the legal one. Russia is pushing a broader interpretation of coastal state authority, environmental enforcement, national security exemptions. These arguments challenge decades of assumptions about freedom of navigation. If they gain traction, even partially, every vessel becomes legally vulnerable. Surveillance, equipment, environmental violations, security risks. Almost any ship can be accused of something. Operating in the legal gray zone. This is why Russia avoided open military force, instead operating in legal gray zones. Moscow raised costs without triggering war. The gamble is simple. Western governments will hesitate to escalate over civilian ships and contested legal claims. And so far, that gamble is holding. What happens next? There are only three realistic paths forward. De-escalation through negotiation, clearer boundaries, quiet compromises, limited restraint on enforcement, normalization of seizures. Commercial assets become routine bargaining chips. Risk becomes permanent. Escalation at sea. More escorts, more confrontations, and a higher chance of disaster. None of these paths are comfortable. The bigger shift this moment marks the end of a long-standing illusion. For decades, economic warfare was assumed to be abstract, numbers on screens, assets in banks, rules on paper. That era is over. Sanctions now come with boarding parties. Legal notices arrive with warships. Trade routes double as pressure points. Power has returned to the foreground. Russia's warning: what Russia has demonstrated is not just capability. It is willingness. Willingness to absorb risk. Willingness to challenge norms. Willingness to force renegotiation through disruption. Other powers are watching closely. If this approach proves effective, it will not remain unique. The sea lanes that once connected the world may now divide it. And in that world, trade will not flow where it is cheapest, but where it is safest. The opening chapter: for decades, global trade functioned on the assumption that commercial shipping was untouchable. That assumption is now dead. What replaces it will define the next era of global competition, an era where trade routes are front lines, and economics and military power are inseparable. The seizure of these vessels is not the end of a story. It is the opening chapter of a far more dangerous one. A turning point. History rarely announces itself in real time. Turning points usually feel confusing, technically but boring. This one doesn't. We are witnessing the beginning of a new phase in global power politics, one where trade, law, and force are no longer separate tools. They are a single weapon. The world is watching and learning. Every major power is studying the outcome. How hard will the West push back? How much pain is Washington willing to tolerate? Does economic retaliation without open war actually work? The answers will shape behavior far beyond this crisis. The dangerous copycat effective. Russia succeeds in imposing costs without catastrophic consequences. Others will follow. If tankers can be seized in the Black Sea, why not the Persian Gulf? If environmental inspections justify boardings, why not the South China Sea? If legal ambiguity protects aggressors, why respect clarity at all? States with regional and naval power are paying attention, especially those already locked in maritime disputes. This is how localized escalation becomes global instability. America's strategic dilemma. This moment exposes an uncomfortable truth. American power has long rested on the belief that naval dominance guarantees free trade for allies everywhere. But dominance only matters if it is used. Respond too weakly, and deterrence erodes. Respond too forcefully, and escalation becomes uncontrollably. The United States now faces a dilemma with no clean solution. Escalation risks war. Restraint invites repetition. This is the cost of gray zone conflict. It traps decision makers between bad options. Europe's hard choice. Europe's position is even more fragile. European economies rely on stable energy prices, predictable shipping, legal certainty. All three have been shaken. Europe must decide: accept higher costs in exchange for principles, or quiet accommodation in exchange for stability. Neither is politically easy, and both carry long-term consequences. Ensure the hidden power. One of the most powerful actors in this story does not wear a uniform. Insurance companies. They decide which routes exist and which do not. If insurers judge certain waters unmanageable, trade stops instantly. Russia understands this perfectly. By introducing uncertainty rather than outright blockade, it forces insurers to rewrite risk models built on decades of assumed restraint. Once rewritten, those models are slow to reverse. This is leverage without confrontation. A new maritime reality. Expect major changes: convoy-style shipping in contested regions, permanent naval presence along trade routes, higher costs passed directly to consumers, militarization of logistics infrastructure. The sea is no longer neutral. It is becoming territorial again. Law is no longer a shield. It is a tool. One of the deepest shifts here is legal. International law was designed to limit conflict. In gray zone, warfare, law becomes a weapon. Ambiguity as a weapon. Ambiguity is exploited. Procedures are weaponized. Enforcement becomes selective. The result: a world where legality depends less on consensus and more on power. The end of costly sanctions. For decades, sanctions were viewed as low risk, tools punished without war, pressure without bloodshed. That illusion is gone. When sanctions move from bank accounts to boarding ladders, retaliation becomes physical. Economic warfare now carries real-world danger, and every escalation increases the risk of miscalculation. 3 futures, only one stable looking ahead. Only 3 broad outcomes are plausible: negotiated boundaries, quiet deals, mutual restraint, clear limits on maritime enforcement, managed confrontation, regular seizures, persistent risk, high costs, but controlled tension, breakdown and escalation. Incidents multiply, escorts clash, a single mistake ignites something far larger. History suggests a third path is always closer than leaders believe. The final message of this crisis is not about ships. It is about power. It is about whether global trade will be governed by shared rules or by proximity to force, Russia has shown it is willing to challenge a system it believes is stacked against it. The response to that challenge will determine whether this was a warning or a blueprint. Because once trade becomes a battlefield, no nation stays untouched. Once the sea stops being safe, the world becomes smaller, poorer, and far more dangerous. Question for the audience: do you believe this marks the beginning of a new Cold War at sea? Or will global powers step back before it's too late? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. The new maritime reality: the sea lanes that once connected the world may now divide it. In that world, trade will not flow where it is cheapest, but where it is safest. For decades, global trade functioned on the assumption that commercial shipping was untouchable. That assumption is now dead. What replaces it will define the next era of global competition. An era where trade routes are front lines, and economics and military power are inseparable. The seizure of these vessels is not the end of a story. It is the opening chapter of a far more dangerous one.